10 people who outlived insane prison sentences. Welcome back to our channel. Today, we're going to talk about 10 individuals who outlived insane prison sentences. These people have spent decades or even lifetimes behind bars, but against all odds, they have managed to survive and overcome the challenges of prison life. 1. Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary who spent 27 years in prison for his activism. He was imprisoned on charges of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Despite being behind bars for almost 3 decades, Mandela remained a symbol of hope and perseverance for people around the world. After his release in 1990, he went on to become the first black president of South Africa in 1994. 2. Richard Phillips. Richard Phillips was wrongfully convicted of murder in 1972 and spent 46 years in prison before being exonerated and released in 2018. He was one of the longest-serving wrongfully convicted prisoners in U.S. history. While in prison, Phillips maintained his innocence and worked tirelessly to prove it. He eventually received help from the Michigan Innocence Clinic and was exonerated based on newly discovered evidence. 3. Frank Lee Morris. Frank Lee Morris was one of the most famous escapees from Alcatraz prison. Along with 2 other inmates, Morris managed to escape the supposedly inescapable prison in 1962. Morris was serving a 14-year sentence for bank robbery at the time of his escape. Despite an extensive manhunt, Morris was never found, and his whereabouts remain unknown to this day. 4. Paul Geidel. Paul Geidel was the longest-serving prisoner in U.S. history. He spent 68 years behind bars for a second-degree murder conviction before being released in 1980. Geidel was arrested in 1911 at the age of 17 for the murder of a New York City taxi driver. He was sentenced to life in prison, and despite multiple appeals and requests for parole, he was not released until he was 85 years old. After his release, Geidel lived a quiet life and died just a few years later at the age of 92. 5. Richard Wersch Jr. Richard Wersch Jr., also known as White Boy Rick, was sentenced to life in prison without parole at the age of 17 for drug trafficking in Detroit. He spent 32 years in prison before being released in 2020 after a parole board determined he had served enough time. Wersch's case gained widespread attention due to his youth at the time of his sentencing and the controversial nature of the war on drugs. 6. Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean is a fictional character from Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. He spent 19 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's children. After his release, Valjean struggles to start a new life and faces constant persecution from Inspector Javert, who is determined to bring him back to prison. Despite the challenges he faces, Valjean eventually becomes a successful businessman and philanthropist. 7. Robert Yummy Sandifer. Robert Yummy Sandifer was a 11-year-old gang member who committed murder in Chicago in 1994. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but was shot and killed by fellow gang members just days after the murder. Sandifer's case sparked controversy and raised questions about the treatment of juvenile offenders in the criminal justice system. 8. John Spanklink. John Spanklink was the first person to be executed in the U.S. after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. He spent 9 years on death row before being executed in 1979 for the murder of a fellow inmate. Spanklink's case brought attention to the controversy surrounding the use of the death penalty, and his execution was protested by many who argued that it was cruel and unusual punishment. 9. William Aarons. William Aarons was a serial killer who was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences in 1946 for the murders of 2 women and a young girl. Aarons maintained his innocence for decades and claimed that he was coerced into making a false confession. Despite several appeals, he remained in prison until his death in 2012. 10. Robert Stroud. Robert Stroud, also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, spent 54 years in prison for multiple murders before being transferred to a medical facility where he spent the remainder of his life. If you like this video, do subscribe our channel. Thanks for watching.